For weeks, the Nancy Guthrie case had the kind of silence that makes a story feel even heavier. No arrest, no major public breakthrough, no clear answer for the family waiting behind the headlines. The world kept moving, but the questions around Nancy's disappearance stayed frozen in place. And then Brian Enton went back, not because the case had been solved, but because something about it still did not feel right. That is often how important questions begin in a true crime investigation. Not with a dramatic confession, not with a suspect suddenly walking into a police station. Sometimes it begins with someone returning to the same street, standing in the same place, and asking a simple question again. Does this timeline really make sense? Because when a case feels too quiet, the silence itself can start to feel like a clue. Brian Enton did not appear to be looking for the obvious. The obvious parts of this case had already been discussed many times. Nancy's disappearance, the home, the camera, the figure, the unanswered questions. But when he returned to the scene, the focus became smaller and sharper. He looked at the space, the timing, the movement, and the possibility that the story everyone had been following still had gaps hiding inside it. That matters, because a timeline can look clean on paper and still feel wrong in real life. A report can list moments in order. A camera can show one part of the night. A witness can remember one small detail. But when you stand in the actual place and imagine someone moving through it in darkness, new questions begin to form. How long would it take? What could be seen? What could be missed? Who would feel comfortable enough to move that way? And that
public records rarely announce a turning point. They just sit there. Flat, procedural, unremarkable, until someone reads them differently. And according to new reporting, that is exactly what happened this week when correspondent Brian Enton returned to the Nancy Guthrie file and found something buried in plain sight, a detail involving a family member close to the household that had never been publicly connected to the timeline before. Here's the image to hold on to for the rest of this video. A quiet house at night, doors locked, cameras mounted, alarm armed, and the uncomfortable truth investigators are now sitting with the most dangerous person in a case like this is rarely the one climbing through a window. It's the one who already has a key.
People who act on impulse often make messy choices. People who prepare can look calm because they believe they already know the risks. That word believe is important because even the most careful person can be wrong. Someone can believe they understand the cameras. They can believe they understand the neighborhood. They can believe they understand the timing, the darkness, and the quiet hours. But a case can turn on the one thing they misunderstood. One missed lens. One witness who remembers. One movement that does not fit. One gap in the timeline that refuses to disappear. This is why Brian Enton going back matters in the story. A reporter returning to the scene can sometimes notice what gets lost when a case becomes only a list of known facts. He can walk the street, study the angles, think about the time it would take to move from one point to another, and ask whether the person responsible had to know more than an average stranger would know. In a case like this, that question can change everything. A stranger guesses. A planner knows. That is one of the strongest ideas in this part of the case. A stranger guesses where cameras are. A planner studies them. A stranger guesses when a home is quiet. A planner learns the routine. A stranger rushes in and hopes. A planner chooses a time, a path, and a method. If Nancy's disappearance was targeted...
Before we go deeper into what the records actually show, make sure you're subscribed to the Crime Infinity. Because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence. Let's be precise about what is public and what is not. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, disappeared from her home under circumstances authorities have described as suspicious, with her case moving through a law enforcement investigation that has, for weeks, produced far more questions than answers. No arrest has been made. No suspect has been officially named in any court filing. That has to be said plainly, because everything that follows depends on that fact remaining true in your mind.
No arrest has been publicly announced. No suspect has been officially identified. No full explanation has been released. That matters because responsible storytelling must stay careful. The point is not to accuse someone without evidence. The point is to understand why the case may still have pressure points, and why those pressure points may be hidden inside timing, movement, and behavior. The strongest investigations do not depend on one feeling. They depend on what can be tested. If a timeline feels wrong, investigators must compare it with cameras, witness memories, phone data, vehicle movement, and physical evidence. If a person seemed prepared, investigators must ask what proof supports that idea. If someone may have watched the home, investigators must look for records, sightings, footage, or repeated patterns that confirm more than suspicion. Still, the feeling that something does not sit right can be the reason people look again. And sometimes looking again is exactly what a case needs. The first review may catch the obvious. The second review may catch the background. The third review may catch the detail no one understood at first. That is why investigators return to scenes, reporters revisit timelines, and families keep asking questions long after public attention begins to fade.
What has changed, according to Anton's reporting, is the direction of scrutiny. For weeks, public attention orbited strangers, an unknown vehicle, an unidentified figure, a neighborhood the family didn't fully control. Now the reporting suggests investigators are also looking somewhere closer to home, at a relative connected to the household through marriage, someone with reported access to the property, its routines, and potentially its security systems. Say that last part again, slowly. Access to its routines, access to its security systems.
Brian Enton's deeper look appears to focus on that kind of gap, the space between what was officially recorded and what may have been felt, seen, or missed by people nearby. That does not mean every uneasy memory becomes evidence. It does not mean every strange car is connected. But it does mean investigators and reporters have to take patterns seriously. One odd moment can be coincidence. Several odd moments around the same place and time may deserve a closer look. This is where the case begins to feel less like chaos and more like design. Not a perfect design, because no plan survives the real world perfectly, but a structure. A person approaches, a camera is targeted, movement appears controlled, questions remain about what happened before and after. When those pieces are placed together, the story begins asking whether this was truly a sudden crime of opportunity or something that had been building quietly. That question is painful because it changes how we think about Nancy herself. If someone watched before the night she disappeared, then this was not just a moment of danger. It was a process. It means someone may have studied a woman's life, her home, her routines, her quiet hours, and the systems meant to protect her. That is a frightening thought, but it is exactly why the timeline matters so much. A timeline is not only about minutes, it is about decisions. Why that house? Why that door? Why that time? Why that approach? Why interfere with the camera instead of avoiding it completely? Why move in a way that seems
That is the phrase this case keeps circling back to, and it deserves its own moral refrain. Proximity is not innocence. Proximity is not innocence. Write it down, because we're going to return to it twice more before this video ends. Here's why that matters. Earlier chapters of this case leaned heavily on the idea of a stranger, someone studying the house from outside, learning the camera angles the way a burglar might, guessing at the quiet hours the way an opportunist would. A stranger has to learn all of that the hard way, through observation, trial, and risk. A family member doesn't. A family member may already know which door sticks, which camera has a blind spot, which nights the house is emptiest, and which alarm code disables the whole system without a struggle. That single distinction, guessing versus knowing, is what separates a random tragedy from something far colder.
How long would it take someone to approach the house, interfere with the camera, control the situation, and leave without drawing attention? That is not a small question. It goes straight to the heart of whether this was random or planned. When Brian Enton looked at the case again, the issue was not chaos. It was control. That is what makes this so unsettling. A chaotic crime can leave obvious mistakes everywhere. A rushed person panics, drops things, runs into problems, or reacts without thinking. But in this case, the movement being discussed feels deliberate, direct, and calm. That kind of control raises a much harder question. Did the person already know what to expect? That is where the timeline begins to feel less clean. If someone moves with confidence in a dark neighborhood, that confidence usually comes from somewhere. Maybe they studied the area. Maybe they had been there before. Maybe they knew where cameras were placed, when the street became quiet, and how long they had before risk increased. A stranger guesses, a planner knows, and that difference can change the entire direction of the investigation. The first missing piece is preparation. If the person responsible knew where to go and what to do, then the crime may not have started when they arrived at Nancy's door. It may have started earlier, with watching. A car passing by more than once. A person moving through the area without drawing attention. Someone learning the rhythm of the neighborhood. Those moments can look ordinary at the time, but after a disappearance, ordinary moments can become deeply important. That is why investigators and reporters look backward. They do not only ask what happened in the final window, they ask what led to it. Who was in the area before? Was the same vehicle seen more than once? Did anyone notice a person who seemed out of place but not dangerous enough to report? Did someone know the quietest time to approach? Did someone understand the camera position?
And it's the distinction investigators are reportedly working through right now, without yet reaching a public conclusion. So ask yourself the question this case now forces onto the table. What does it mean when the person best positioned to protect a household is also the person best positioned to understand exactly how to move through it unnoticed?
If Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was planned, then the story did not begin at her front door. That is the uncomfortable possibility at the center of this chapter. A person who acts without preparation has to guess. They guess the right time. They guess where cameras are. They guess whether anyone is awake. But a person who watches first does not need to guess as much. They move differently because they believe they already understand the space. That is why the idea of prior observation matters so much in Nancy's case. Brian Enton's deeper look raised the possibility that whoever came to the home may have understood more than a stranger should. The layout, the routines, the quiet hours, the cameras, the timing, and the way the area felt at night may have been known before the moment arrived. That kind of awareness does not usually appear from nowhere. It often comes from watching. Watching does not always look dramatic. It does not have to be someone hiding in the bushes or standing outside a window like a scene from a movie. Real observation can be quieter than that. A car passing through the neighborhood more than once. A person walking by and looking too long. Someone parking nearby for a few minutes. Someone learning which houses have cameras and which parts of the street stay dark. Most people would not notice it until later. That is what makes this possibility so frightening. A neighborhood can feel normal while someone is studying it. People go to work, lights turn on and off, cars come and go, dogs bark, packages are delivered. Nothing seems important in the moment. But after a crime, those same ordinary moments can feel different. A vehicle that passed too often, a figure that appeared more than once, a presence that did not belong but did not seem dangerous enough to report. This is why investigators often look backward after a disappearance. They are not only trying to understand the night itself, they are trying to understand the days and weeks before it. Did anyone test the area? Did a vehicle appear in the background more than once? Did someone ask questions about Nancy, her home, her routine, or her cameras?
That's not an accusation. It's a structural fact about how investigations work. Detectives don't build cases on suspicion of closeness. They build them on physical evidence, digital records, and timelines that either hold together or don't. But closeness does something else. It reorders where investigators look first. A stranger has to be found. A family member is already in the file. According to the reporting, what pushed this detail back into focus wasn't a new confession or a dramatic discovery. It was something much quieter, a re-examination of financial and communication records already collected earlier in the investigation, reportedly showing contact patterns between the son-in-law and members of the household in the days surrounding Nancy's disappearance that investigators had not fully mapped out the first time through.
A person who studies a place often leaves signs before the main event. That possibility is frightening because it means the night Nancy vanished may not have been the beginning. It may have been the final step in a longer process. Someone may have watched the home. Someone may have learned the timing. Someone may have learned the timing. Someone may have waited until everything looked safe. And if that happened, then the timeline has to stretch backward far beyond the moment the public usually focuses on. The fifth missing piece is the human gap. Cameras show movement, but they do not explain motive. They can capture a person approaching, leaving, or interfering with something, but they cannot always explain why. That answer may come from people: a neighbor who noticed something, a person who remembers a strange vehicle, someone who knows the suspect, someone who heard a comment that did not seem important at the time. This is why memory matters, even though memory is not perfect. People forget. They misremember. They become unsure after time passes. But uncertainty is not always useless. If several people remember small discomforts around the same window, investigators may see a pattern worth testing. Not because feelings prove guilt, but because repeated observations can point toward a person, a vehicle, or a route that deserves closer attention.
Contact isn't a crime. Timing isn't a crime. But timing that doesn't match an earlier account is the kind of small inconsistency that reopens a file that looked finished. This is where the reference point matters. Inconsistency doesn't prove guilt, but it destroys the comfort of a clean story. And clean stories are what protect people in the early days of an investigation. Once the story stops being clean, the pressure shifts from the family grieving in public to the individuals whose accounts no longer line up cleanly with the record. Here is the second time we return to the phrase, because it belongs here. Proximity is not innocence, but it is also not guilt. It is a reason to look harder, not a reason to conclude.
A silence that once seemed ordinary may become important. A camera fragment that once looked useless may become part of the path. That is the moment when a plan meets reality. The plan says everything is controlled. Reality says one camera saw more than expected. The plan says nobody noticed. Reality says a neighbor remembers something. The plan says the timeline is clean. Reality says there is a gap. The plan says the person was invisible. Reality says the environment was recording all along, in pieces, from different angles, through different people. Nancy Guthrie's family deserves the truth, not a theory that only sounds good. They deserve answers that can be proven. That is why every fragment matters only if it can be connected responsibly. A camera clip has to be matched. A memory has to be tested. A movement has to be compared. A pattern has to be supported. This is how investigators turn uncertainty into something strong enough to hold. So the final question is not whether the person responsible had a plan. The question is where that plan failed. Was it at the camera? Was it in the timing? Was it before the night, when someone may have been watching? Was it after the night, when movement had to continue? Was it in a witness memory, a camera angle, or a gap that never fully made sense? Because even the most careful plan cannot escape reality forever. It has to move through real streets, past real homes, around real people, under real cameras, and through real time. And somewhere inside that reality, there may already be a mistake waiting to be fully understood. The case remains unresolved, but the pattern is coming into focus. And when the fragments finally become a picture, the person who thought that...
What Enton's reporting reportedly surfaces next is a question about the security system itself. Specifically, whether it had been recently serviced, adjusted, or accessed by someone with legitimate reason to be near the panel in the days before Nancy vanished. If a system was modified by someone who had every right to touch it, that fact alone means nothing. But if that modification happens to fall inside the same narrow window investigators are already treating as significant, it stops being a footnote and starts being a data point that has to be explained, on the record, by the person who made it. That's the mechanism driving this story forward. Not a smoking gun, not a confession, a series of ordinary facts, a contact log, a service record, a gap in an earlier statement, that only become significant when they're placed next to each other instead of read in isolation.
And that's precisely why investigators reportedly returned to interview witnesses a second time. The first interview establishes a story. The second interview tests it against everything collected since. People who told the truth the first time rarely have anything to fear from being asked again. People whose account was built around one convenient gap sometimes find that gap harder to explain the second time, once investigators already know what else the record shows. None of this means an arrest is coming. It means the file has widened, and widening a file changes who has to answer for what.
A random act often looks messy. It carries panic, confusion, and wasted movement. But what has made this case so disturbing is the feeling of control. The person involved seemed to move with purpose. The camera was not ignored. The scene was not approached as if the person had no idea what they were doing. Instead, the behavior being studied suggests someone who believed they understood the environment and the risks inside it. But every plan, no matter how careful, has to touch the real world. That is where mistakes happen. A person can plan for darkness, but not for every camera. They can plan for silence, but not for every neighbor. They can plan for timing, but not for every delay. They can plan for one path, but not for the way investigators may later rebuild that path from fragments they never thought would matter. That is the central pressure point in Nancy's case. If the person responsible prepared in advance, then the plan depended on precision. They had to know when to arrive, where to stand, how to approach, what camera to deal with, how long they could remain there, and how to leave without drawing attention. But precision is fragile. One small interruption can change everything. One gap in the plan can become the thread investigators pull. Brian Enton's reporting focus seems to return again and again to the gaps. Not just the facts themselves, but the spaces between them. The movement that does not fully connect. The timeline that does not feel complete. The parts of the night that may appear smooth only because something has not been explained.
Authorities have not named the son-in-law or anyone else as a suspect in any official capacity. His attorneys, if he has retained one, have not issued a public statement addressing these details as of this recording. That absence of comment is not evidence of anything. It is simply the current state of the public record, and responsible reporting has to say so clearly. So where does that leave the actual open question of this case? It leaves it exactly where every unresolved disappearance eventually lands, with a family still waiting, a timeline still incomplete, and a set of ordinary facts that only investigators, not commenters, not YouTube channels, not amateur theorists, have the authority and the evidence to fully connect. Still, one thing about this new reporting is hard to unsee once you've heard it. This case was built for weeks on the fear of the stranger at the door. What's emerging now is a colder possibility, that the most consequential answers may not be found by studying who came from outside the family's world, but by more carefully studying who never had to leave it. Proximity is not innocence. Say it a third and final time, because it's the sentence this entire chapter of the case now rests on. It is not a verdict. It is a warning to investigators not to let familiarity do the work that evidence is supposed to do. If Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is ever fully explained, it likely won't be because of one dramatic reveal. It will be because someone went back through records that already existed, a contact log, a service ticket, a discrepancy in a statement, and finally placed them in the right order. That is what responsible investigation looks like. Not